Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is our third lecture of the 2026 lecture series. We are very lucky to be joined today by Dr. Armadale, who's joining us from Loughborough University, and we'll be talking all about Wilkie Collins, his connections to Marylebone, and his writings, female identity and mental illness. I think she'll give a much better explanation. But yes, enjoy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. So yes, as Calvina said, it's kind of a paper of three parts. So I'm going to do the shortest bit talking a bit about Collins, his life, because talking to some of you, I know some of you know all that already, some of you might not know so much, so bear with me if I'm telling you things you know. And then the second sort of section is about Collins' treatment of the law in his novels. And then the third section is about sort of mental ill health, because that's a key area of my research. I work on Victorian lunatic asylums. So just a kind of a trigger warning, some of the language, obviously, that was used to talk about mental health back in that period is not language we'd use now. So when I'm saying things like lunatic and madness, you know that I'm not kind of assuming that that's how we think of it now. Okay, so I'll get started. I'm afraid I've had to kind of write it as a paper because the brain fog is real, people. Okay, so the Victorian era prided itself on order, rationality, and moral certainty. Yet beneath this polished surface lay deep anxieties about the boundaries of sanity, identity, and control. Nowhere are these tensions more vividly explored than in the works of Wilkie Collins, whose sensation novels probe the fragile line between reason and madness, particularly in relation to women. In a legal system that often conflated female deviance with mental instability, Collins exposes how diagnoses of madness could be wielded as instruments of social discipline, silencing women and stripping them of autonomy. This talk is going to examine how Collins not only reflects Victorian fears surrounding gender and mental illness, but also challenges the legal and cultural frameworks that sought to define and confine female identity. But first of all, the slides aren't moving, there they are. First of all, a brief introduction to the man himself. So, born William Wilkie Collins was born in London on the 8th of January in 1824. His father, William Collins, was a successful landscape painter and a member of the Royal Academy, while his mother, Harriet, had worked as a teacher before she married. His parents gave him the middle name Wilkie in honour of Sir David Wilkie, who was a close friend of the family and a fellow painter. And he was called Wilkie pretty much throughout his life by pretty much everyone who knew him, except his mother, who called him Willie. Collins was baptised here in the St Marylebone Parish Church by the Reverend Chapman on the 18th of February 1824. The family finances were often tight when Collins was growing up, but things improved when his father began selling paintings to important patrons, including Sir Robert Peel and the Earl of Liverpool. In 1826, when Wilkie was still very young, the family moved to Pond Street near Hampstead Heath. Their home soon became a lively place, hosting well-known visitors like the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, someone Collins greatly admired. A couple of years later, his younger brother Charles Alston was born, who would later marry Kate Dickens, the daughter of Wilkie's famous mentor. Collins was deeply connected to Marylebone, both as a resident and as an author, and his fiction frequently mirrors his personal geography. He lived in various houses across the area throughout his life: Gloucester Place, New Cavendish Street, Harley Street, and Wimpole Street, where he died. The house in which he established Martha Rudd, the mother of his children, was in Bolsover Street. The area also served as a backdrop for his work. For example, he often referenced or set scenes in nearby districts like Sir John's Wood in novels such as Basil and The Woman in White. His intimate knowledge of the neighbourhood where he was born and lived for most of his life arguably influenced the settings of his sensation novels. Beyond the immediate parish, he often drew upon the broader North London landscape he knew so well. In 1841, Collins found himself stuck in a job he thoroughly disliked, apprenticed to a tea merchant's firm, Antrobus and Company. During this period, he travelled across Europe, and it was on these journeys that he began writing his first novel, Iolani. It was rejected by publishers twice, and then it quietly disappeared for over a century, only resurfacing when it was finally published in 1999. But Collins didn't give up. By 1843, he had his first taste of publication with The Last Stagecoachman, and then in 1846 he made a decisive break. Leaving the tea business behind with his father's support, he went to study law at Lincoln's Inn. He never became a practicing lawyer, but what he did gain was invaluable. He absorbed the logic of legal systems, but also saw their cracks, the inequalities embedded in laws governing marriage, property, and inheritance. These insights would go on to shape some of his best fiction. And yet, just as his literary ambitions were taking shape, tragedy intervened. In 1847, his father died, and Collins set aside his novel to write Memoirs of the Life of William Collins, Esquire, R.A. Completed in just 6 months, it became his first published book, and, importantly, a success. His first novel followed 2 years later, in 1850. Antonina, or The Fall of Rome, is a historical novel and quite different in many respects to the sensational tales of contemporary life for which he became famous. Basil, which followed Antonina, in 1852, was the first of these, and in many respects it can claim to be one of the earliest sensation novels, several years before The Woman in White catapulted the genre into the critical limelight. So the 4 novels of the 1860s, The Woman in White, No Name, Armadale, and The Moonstone, were Collins' biggest successes in both critical and commercial terms, and they remained the best known of his fiction, with the critical consensus being that he never managed to replicate their excellence. The general opinion of Collins' later fiction for a long time remained largely negative. Various reasons for the supposed decline in literary quality have been offered, including the death of Dickens, Collins' increasing dependency on opium, his deteriorating health, and even the adverse influence of fellow novelist Charles Reade, who many blamed for Collins' latter tendency towards didactic social messaging. Augustus Charles Swinburne, the poet, immortalised this view in his famous couplet: "What brought good Wilkie's genius nigh perdition? Some demon whispered, Wilkie, have a mission." All of these factors, to some extent, undoubtedly affected Collins' later career, and he never regained the phenomenal success of the 1860s. Nevertheless, there does remain much of interest in the later fiction. Collins, as we've just been speaking about, led a complicated romantic life. He was deeply involved with 2 women, Elizabeth Caroline Compton Graves, known as Caroline, and Martha Rudd. He lived with Caroline, her on the right, and Caroline's daughter from 1858 until 1868, when she left him to marry someone else, and she was kind of ostensibly his housekeeper. Around that same time, Martha became pregnant with their first child, Marion, followed by 2 more, Harriet Constance and William Charles. Eventually, Caroline returned, and Collins sustained relationships with both women and his children. He never married, but he ensured they were all cared for, funding his children's education and leaving inheritances to both women. His unconventional lifestyle reflected his unusual thinking on certain topics, particularly pertaining to the position of women, and his fiction offered a potent vehicle for the exploration of these ideas, his critique of Victorian morality and his outright criticism of aspects of the law. So the 19th century witnessed widespread legal reform. I don't think any century beforehand had ever seen so many kind of laws passed in such a short space of time. And there was also an unprecedented expansion of bureaucracy. So it's unsurprising that novelists of the period engaged so extensively with the topic of the law in their fiction. The creation of a unified police force, the rise of forensic science in the detection of crime, extensive public interest in criminal trials and the nature of evidence, and the rise of the legal professional all contributed to a new literary emphasis on the role of the law. Collins was foremost amongst the Victorian writers who negotiated the contemporary legal world. As we've seen, he had trained as a lawyer, studying at Lincoln's Inn between 1835 and 1842, but never practised after being called to the bar. This legal training nevertheless inflected his fiction, not only at the level of narrative and plot, but more fundamentally in its ideological, philosophical and polemical aspects. As Catherine Peters claims in her excellent biography of Collins, the intricacies and inconsistencies of the law interested him. He could have made a good lawyer. In a practical sense, his legal background must have been invaluable in the habits of attention to detail and ordered mind required for structuring his complicated plots. These plots often had their origins in historical or contemporaneous legal cases and criminal trials. Collins acknowledged that The Woman in White was inspired by his reading of a collection of French trials, and William Baker has demonstrated that he possessed numerous law books in his personal library. In addition, Collins also drew parallels between literature and legal discourse through his experiments with narrative form. The multiple narrators of The Woman in White and The Moonstone are key aspects of his narratorial innovations, which are imitative of legal trials and testimony. Walter Hartwright begins his narration in The Woman in White like a barrister assembling his evidence. As the judge might once have heard it, so the reader shall hear it now. The shortcomings of the law are a central theme in most of Collins' major novels, providing the entire impetus for the plot in The Woman in White, No Name, The Law and the Lady, and Man and Wife in particular. Collins was still engaging with contemporary legal questions up until his final novel, Blind Love, in which he examines Fenian politics through the dual lens of the Irish question and the woman question. In Collins' fiction, the law is always inextricably entangled with the moral and the social. There is rarely a sense of pure justice, no legal question untainted by moral implications. As Philip O'Neill argues, what Collins shows in a novel such as No Name is that life must be organised around the dictates of the law rather than the dictates of the heart and the emotions. The law determines how we should lead our lives, and a challenge to the law is an attack on society itself. So the law then for Collins is always a complex and tangled entity which cannot be separated from individual social and psychological identity. From the outset of The Woman in White, Collins makes clear his critical stance in regard to the law, which he implies is not only imperfect, but also potentially corrupt. If the machinery of the law could be depended on, Hartwright suggests, the events which fill these pages might have claimed their share of the public attention in a court of justice, but the law is still, in certain inevitable cases, the pre-engaged servant of the long purse. A decade later, Collins took similar swipes at the ways in which the law could be complicit with immoral actions. In the prologue to Man and Wife, John Vanbrugh manages to dispose of his unwanted wife Anne when his unprincipled lawyer Delamain informs him of a convenient legal loophole relating to the Irish marriage laws. Collins revisits the trope of the law being in service to wealth and iniquity, declaring the legislature of Great Britain to be the humble servant of Vanbrugh's treachery and the respectable accomplice of his crime. In stipulating an action endorsed by law as a crime, Collins disrupts the stable categories of licit and illicit, thereby calling into question accepted notions of justice. Collins' fiction generally is fascinated by abstruseness, contradiction, and liminality, So it's not surprising that ambiguous points of law and convoluted legal discourse furnish the impetus for many of his plots. For Collins, those points of law where the moral and the judicial are in conflict provide the ideal scenario because they produce extreme psychological states and social situations generative of dramatic interest. As a leading proponent of the sensation novel, which dominated literary discourse and popular sales through the 1860s, Collins was working within a genre characterised by explicit engagement with the legal debates of the day. If crime and transgression were the hallmarks of sensation fiction, then these themes were reflective of contemporary social change, including debates around the marriage laws and increased newspaper reportage of high-profile divorce and bigamy cases. Collins' novel in particular demonstrate the centrality of the law in determining women's identity and their position within society. In The Woman in White, the issue of female identity is complex. The theft of Laura Fairley's identity by Count Fosco and Sir Percival Guide is comprehensive, touching every part of her existence. As Walter Hartwright defines Laura's situation, she is socially, morally, legally dead. The death of Laura, resultant on her marriage, may be seen as symbolic of a woman's fate under the Victorian marriage laws, where her entire legal entity was covered by that of her husband and thereby erased. Collins posits how modern identity itself has become a matter to be evidentially proven, and in doing so exposes the various ways in which the law colludes against women who are victimised by unscrupulous men. The Woman in White reveals the fragmentary and vulnerable nature of identity, and also the different ways in which men and women may be constructed through legal processes. So, where Sir Percival is ultimately denied his rightful identity through an absence of marriage, i.e. his illegitimacy, Laura is stripped of her identity as a result of marriage, when in legal and social terms she ceases to exist. In his subsequent novel, Collins returned to the issue of illegitimacy. No Name attacks the law of England as it affects illegitimate offspring as, quote, a disgrace to the nation. This disgrace is dramatised through the plight of sisters Nora and Magdalene Vanstone, whose affluent and secure existence is abruptly terminated on the death of their parents. It emerges that the Vanstones had only been married for a very short time prior to their untimely demise, and that the daughters are therefore illegitimate. Even though a will had been drawn up by the parents to provide for them years ago, the subsequent marriage invalidates this document, and the sisters are dispossessed of their inheritance in favour of a distant male cousin. For Collins, who never married the mother of his own children, Martha Rudd, the laws governing the fate of illegitimate offspring were of deeply personal interest. His novel is outspoken in its disgust at what Collins sees as the false morality governing such laws, and for some contemporary critics of the novel, his indignation was a step too far. One reviewer complained that, in No Name, Collins attempted to gild one of the greatest offences a man can commit against the laws of morality, and excited sympathy for that which should be visited with stern reprobation. The Vanstones' family solicitor, on the other hand, Mr. Pendrell, becomes Collins' mouthpiece in condemning the laws which disinherit Magdalene and Nora. It violates every principle of Christian mercy. It is not the law of Scotland, not the law of France, not the law of any other civilised community in Europe. Whereas Scottish law is the target of criticism in The Lord Lady and in Man and Wife, here Collins emphasises that in this matter it is English law that is less civilised and less merciful than other nations. In their legal position as filius nullius, nobody's child, the Vanstone sisters embody a familiar state in Collins' fiction, one where identity itself is rendered unstable, either through legal uncertainties or legal injustice. The impact of the law on social identity is seen again in Man and Wife, where, Anne Sylvester's uncertain marital status subjects her to a similar loss of identity. As Anne Longmuir argues, unless she can legitimate her marriage to Geoffrey Delamain, Anne Sylvester faces losing her social identity, as Lady Lundy's refusal to refer to Anne's sex or name indicates. Of all Collins' literary engagements with the law, it's arguably in Man and Wife from 1870 that he mounts his most sustained and polemical critique. In the preface, Collins announces his intention to tackle, quote, the present scandalous condition of the marriage laws of the United Kingdom. This was eminently topical, as the Royal Commission had set up to inquire into the state of marriage and had issued its report in 1868, the year in which the action of the novel is set. Collins makes direct reference to this commission in his preface and in the novel itself, and he even includes an appendix directing his reader to specific parts of the report as evidence that his fiction is founded on facts. Collins' villain, Geoffrey Delamain, has seduced Anne Sylvester and reneged on his promise to marry her, and of course she's pregnant. Unbeknownst to both Geoffrey and Anne, the former's father was instrumental in the ruin of Anne's mother through his legal advice to John Vanbrugh, as I mentioned earlier. So in a familiar Collins theme, history repeats itself through subsequent generations. Geoffrey manages to cast Anne aside by pretending to believe that she's already married to Arnold Brinklow. So this is very confusing to explain, but Arnold is engaged to marry Anne's best friend, Blanche, but he fears that he's accidentally married Anne under the Scottish laws governing irregular marriages because they had inadvertently stayed the night in the same house unchaperoned. We can talk about that in questions if you're confused. The main thrust of the plot involves the untangling of these legal threads to ascertain the precise marital status of the central characters. To this end, Collins' novel features a whole array of lawyers, from the compassionate Sir Patrick Lundy to the ruthless Delamain. Delamain has a momentary sympathy for Anne Vanbrugh, the woman he has helped to ruin, which is immediately dismissed by his reflection that it is the law. He owned it was hard on her, but the law justified it. Sir Patrick is ranged with Collins' benign legal professionals, such as Pendrell in No Name, Pedgift in Armadale, and Brough in The Moonstone, whereas Delamain's self-interest aligns him more with the criminal lawyers of Dickens' fiction, such as Tulkinghorn and Jaggers. Between these two extremes of critical interpretation of the law and human inflexibility, there is a whole class of undistinguished legal drones of whom Collins is candidly dismissive. I hope there's no lawyers in the room. Lady Lundy's, there probably isn't. Lady Lundy's solicitor in Man and Wife is described as one of that large class of purely mechanical and perfectly mediocre persons connected with the practice of the law, who will probably, in a more advanced state of science, be superseded by machinery. Harsh. Whether ruthless in their own interests or merely ineffectual, the lawyers who are critiqued in Collins' novels lack humaneness. Their dogmatic adherence to laws which Collins lambasts as cruel and unjust sets them apart from those who are willing to work creatively with, or even outside of, those laws where necessary for the attainment of justice. In Man and Wife, it's not only the laws relating to irregular marriages that are subject to Collins' critique, as, in his words, an outrage on common decency and common sense. The legal rights of the husband over his wife's body, as inscribed in the law of coverture, are also castigated by Collins. Once Geoffrey Delamain has been proven by the disputation of lawyers to be Anne's legal husband, another injustice of the law is immediately exposed. Geoffrey's power over the woman he now hates and wishes to be rid of by any means is absolute and upheld by the laws of the land. So this is Geoffrey speaking. The law tells her to go with her husband, he said. The law forbids you to part man and wife. So forced to cohabit with a man who is plotting her murder, Anne is afraid equally for her safety and her virtue. There were outrages which her husband was privileged to commit under the sanction of marriage, at the bare thought of which her blood ran cold. Law and society armed her husband with his conjugal rights. So the novelist and critic Margaret Oliphant, in an otherwise broadly complimentary review, felt bound to protest that Anne's predicament at this climactic moment in the novel was implausible. Oliphant said, though she and everybody else believes her life to be in danger, there is not one about her, though she is surrounded by lawyers, who has sufficient presence of mind to assure her that the law does not require her to give herself over to be killed, even to her husband. Oliphant's objection is reasonable, but it's not necessarily sound. Anne's friends lack definite evidence that Geoffrey intends to do her harm, and more importantly, legal precedents had highlighted the reluctance of the law to protect the rights of married women. The Cochrane decision of 1840, in which a judge upheld Alexander Cochrane's right to imprison his wife Cecilia Maria until she resumed her wifely duties, had disturbingly shown how women were vulnerable to abusive male control under Victorian marriage laws. Collins was obviously writing 30 years after this case, but the judge's ruling had been precedent-setting, and campaigners for women's rights frequently cited the Cochrane decision as a key example of the need for legal change. Writing in the Westminster Review in 1856, Caroline Frances Cornwallis reminded her readers of the details of the case and concluded that the common law views the relation of husband and wife as that of master and bondswoman. A hired servant could not be so treated. Given that it was not until 1891 that a High Court ruling denied a husband the right to imprison his wife in pursuit of his conjugal rights, and another century before British law finally passed legislation overturning the marital exemption to the law of rape in 1991, Collins' powerful representation of Anne's predicament is not that far-fetched. He writes, "The law sanctioned the sacrifice of her as unanswerably as it had sanctioned the sacrifice of her mother before her." Having attacked the Irish and the Scottish marriage laws, Collins then proceeds through the character of the servant Hester Dethridge to confront the English married woman's property laws too. Married to a wastrel who appropriates her earnings and modest inherited property to fund his tastes for strong liquor, Hester is compelled to seek assistance from the law. A sympathetic policeman explains to her that under English law, she is not entitled to own her own property, and that everything she possesses legally belongs to her husband. Collins encourages his reader to question this state of affairs through Hester's pathetic plight and unanswerable logic. "I've been told by wiser heads than mine that we all pay our taxes to keep the Queen and the Parliament going, and that the Queen and the Parliament make laws to protect us in return. I have paid my taxes. Why, if you please, is there no law to protect me in return?" Deprived of any protection from her increasingly abusive husband, Hester finally resorts to murdering him as the only escape she perceives possible from her legally endorsed subjection. Collins arguably includes the personal history of Hester Dethridge to demonstrate that women from all social classes are subject to these legal inequities. However, it's noteworthy that Anne's story is able to happily resolve because she has affluent and influential friends. Hester, on the other hand, descends into total insanity and is incarcerated for the rest of her life. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Collins' critique of unjust laws in Man and Wife is his disquieting depiction of the psychological harm done to women, the consequences of which he renders physically on their bodies. Hester's elective mutism and her increasing insanity are the collateral damage of her abusive marriage, from which the law had refused to protect her. Similarly, Anne's emotional ordeal at the hands of Delamain are depicted visibly through a steady physical deterioration and loss of vitality and beauty. Her pregnancy and traumatic delivery of a stillborn baby are barely confronted by the novel and encoded as too traumatic to articulate fully. In Anne's refusal to speak of her trauma to any of the other characters, she is linked to the mute Hester, and their shared silence is indicative of the psychological harm inflicted on women with the permission of the law. So Collins was a key voice in the debates about women's rights and legal reform in the second half of the 19th century, and his novels constituted an important part of the national conversation. Shortly after the publication of Man and Wife in 1870, the Irish marriage laws were reformed, and the first Married Women's Property Act was passed. In his preface to the second edition, Collins noted the shortcomings of the latter act, but conceded that it was, quote, better than no law at all. His championing of such causes within some of the most widely read novels of the day undoubtedly lent momentum to the popular mandate for change. So I'm going to move on to the second part of the talk now, but I'm not sure I'm going to get through all of it, so I'll see how we go. So, as previously mentioned, Hester Dethridge in Man and Wife ends her days incarcerated in a lunatic asylum, and Collins' interest in insanity and aberrant states of mind, as well as the institution of the asylum, is evident elsewhere across his body of work. Most famously, of course, the asylum plays a vital function in the plot of The Woman in White. Unlike Man and Wife, where Hester's insanity is never really in question, in Collins' most famous novel, the demarcation between reason and sanity is more ambiguous, and constructions of madness are scrutinised. Before I say more about the representation of mental disorders in Collins' work, I'll offer some context about mental illness, Victorian lunacy laws, and the asylum system at the time that Collins was writing. So most people are familiar with the atrocious treatment of the mentally afflicted in previous centuries and up until the late 18th century. Madness was used as a broad umbrella term that included people with learning disabilities, epilepsy, and dementia. Britain's oldest asylum, Bethlehem Hospital, known as Bethlehem or Bedlam, typified the inhumane treatment of lunatics, which included chaining them to walls, the use of manacles, stocks, corporal punishment, and isolation. Towards the end of the 18th century, Philippe Pinel, often referred to as the father of modern psychiatry, pioneered what became known as the moral management of lunatics. Pinel advocated new approaches to mental health, which included the termination of using shackles and restraints and the termination of ill treatment of patients. In England, Pinel's approach to lunacy was adopted by the Quaker William Tuke at his York retreat, and a little later by John Connolly at Hanwell Asylum. So by the time that Collins was writing, the asylum system in Britain was much reformed, and it was based on humane principles and non-restraint. This did not, though, prevent many Victorians from distrusting early psychiatry, and lunacy law, asylum abuse, and the false incarceration of the same were sensational topics of debate throughout the second half of the 19th century. Genres such as sensation fiction, with which Collins was primarily associated, reflected these anxieties, often featuring insanity and asylums in their plots. And because this was a transitional time in the treatment and perception of mental illness, novelists of the 1860s and 1870s blended up-to-date knowledge of psychiatric and asylum practices with older, Gothicized tropes of incarceration, producing composite depictions that dramatized these shifting attitudes. In the mid-Victorian period, private and pauper lunatic asylums were distinguished both by social function and by law. Private asylums catered to fee-paying patients, usually from the middle and upper classes, and were regulated primarily through licensing and inspection under the Lunacy Acts of 1845, which aimed to curb abuses by requiring certification, regular visits by the lunacy commissioners, and formal admission procedures. Pauper lunatic asylums, by contrast, were publicly funded institutions established by county authorities under the same 1845 legislation, which decreed in part that every county in England had to have at least one state-funded asylum. While both types were subject to legal oversight, pauper asylums were more tightly integrated into local government and welfare administration, reflecting a legal and moral shift towards state responsibility for the care of the insane poor. In comparison, private asylums continue to operate within a quasi-market framework shaped by contractual relationships and class expectations. At key points through the second half of the Victorian period, public concerns over the laws relating to lunatic asylums reached a crescendo, leading to a series of what Peter McCandless has termed lunacy panics. Invariably, these peaks of anxiety were provoked by scandals and sensational revelations of false certification and incarceration in private asylums of people subsequently pronounced sane. Despite frequent reassurances from the medical profession, there was widespread public suspicion of the asylum system, particularly in relation to private establishments, and the literary representations predominantly depicted the asylum as a place to be feared. The high-profile cases of women such as Louisa Lowe, Rosina Bulwer-Lytton and Georgina Weldon, who were all maliciously incarcerated by their husbands and came out and wrote exposés based on their experiences, have tended to give the impression that the lunacy laws were chiefly abused by husbands attempting to get rid of unwanted wives. This was certainly one aspect of the incarceration scandals that erupted with regularity through the period, and most recently John Bowen has found archival evidence to indicate that Dickens attempted to rid himself of his wife Catherine by getting her erroneously declared insane. Yet research has demonstrated that this is just one facet. Sorry, I'm a bit croaky, I'm just coming out of a cold. The demographic of people falsely confined in the 19th century was surprisingly diverse in terms of class, age and gender. Sarah Wise, in her book Inconvenient People, cites examples of women using lunacy laws to their advantage by exploiting the relative ease of having someone declared insane as a method by which unhappy wives might get rid of drunken, abusive husbands. This often proved easier than appealing to the magistrates, especially given the double standard encoded within Victorian law, and it was much cheaper than the divorce courts. Louisa Lowe, who wrote one of these, Bastilles of England, summed up the fears of many when she wrote, "Few weeks pass that the papers do not record one or more mysterious disappearances. Who shall say how many of these are simply engulfments in the madhouse oubliette?" The statement gestures to more than one dimension of the lunacy panics, the conspiracy theories that abounded, the sensational press coverage of each scandal that erupted, and the perception on the part of many people that it was far too easy to have someone certified insane and consequently locked away. In reality, it was far more difficult than it had been previously. In the case of private lunatic asylums, 2 medical men were required to have examined a patient within the previous 7 days, and both agreed that they were insane. We see this protocol followed but manipulated in The Woman in White. Most doctors were inexperienced in diagnosing conditions of the mind, and ideology also inevitably crept in, meaning that non-conformity to a dominant code of morality could be sufficient to lead to a certification of madness. In Lady Audley's Secret, Collins' contemporary Mary Elizabeth Braddon dramatises this through the fate of Lucy Audley, whose transgressions against the ideals of femininity and her ruthless self-preservation are described by Dr. Mosgrove as not mad, but dangerous. He agrees to declare Lucy medically insane, and she is shipped off to a maison de santé in Belgium, which conveniently sidesteps the necessity for a second doctor's judgment and the formal paperwork of lunacy certification. In The Woman in White, part of the reason that Count Fosco and Percival Glyde are able to switch Laura Fairley and Anne Catherick's identity and fake Laura's death so successfully is because legally her marriage has already rendered her blank. The Woman in White, of course, on one level of signification, is a woman in a wedding dress. Once married, Laura legally loses her property, her social position, and her very identity. Collins implies that it's only a logical step further for her husband to stage her death and have her incarcerated in an insane asylum. So given the time, I'm going to skip my final section and I'm just going to go straight to the conclusion, if that's okay with everybody, so I'd like to leave time for questions. So bear with me while I just whiz through these. Oh, no, do it too. Never mind, we don't need those.
Just come back to...
Yeah, that's okay, I don't need the slides. And I'm just trying to find my conclusion. Sorry about this, people. So the mid-Victorian period then was a transitional time for medical and cultural thinking about emotion and sensation and the law. It's an oversimplification to say that Victorian women were seen as natural. As seen. That's what again. Sorry, it's all going to pot. It's going so well. Okay. If critics of the sensation novels, such as Margaret Oliphant, continually castigated the 1860s sensation heroine for feeling too much too vividly, then writers like Collins implicitly defended the expression of sensation as a healthier alternative to an absence of emotion and empathy. And this is what we see in his kind of critiques of the law, that the letter of the law is cold, whereas heart is what kind of matters. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Can we cut that last bit off the recording? I realised I had too much in the last section, so I thought I'll jump to my conclusion, but my conclusion then was about the last section, so it didn't work. So sorry.
We would happen if it just was.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I just didn't want to kind of outstay my welcome.
Not a problem. We'll open it up to questions now. If you'd like the microphone, just let me know and I'll bring it over. But yes, any questions? And thank you for that amazing presentation.
You're going to ask us something hard, aren't you?
Just take one example in the present day of a couple who is married, had several children, 3 children. How would that relationship have been described by Wilkie Collins? Would it be an illegitimate marriage, or would it be described in some other way?
It's very difficult to know what he'd say now, but I mean, I think he would be pleased that that wasn't considered to be such a disgrace, and that there was such a strong social cost to, you know, people not marrying as it was in his own time. He just thought marriage was kind of institutionally stacked against women, that the laws were, you know, just inequitable, so he decided to dispense with it himself. I don't think he'd have a problem with people cohabiting today and having children outside of marriage. I'm not sure that's what you're getting at, though.
Well, since you...
Yes, he didn't have a problem himself.
Yeah, exactly. Since this was his own practice, and I think he wouldn't have been...
Yeah.
I mean, did he not marry as a point of principle?
No, he never married.
Yes, but
Oh,
as a point of principle, he decided not to get married.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think he loved both of them very much.
Yes.
He always, you know, very much played his responsibilities. He provided for them all financially after his death. He kind of spent time in both houses. We don't know that much about how they felt about each other, but they're all buried in the same grave. So when Caroline kind of tended his grave after his death, and then when Caroline died, she was buried with him, and Martha tended the grave until she went there as well. So, yeah.
Sorry. Look, I was just going to make a comment. There is a modern phrase for that. Stay single and keep many happy. And I think that's probably more of what he was doing rather than principle. He wanted both women. So it was easy not to marry them.
I think he was also just quite bohemian, and I think he just he was very aware of the double standard that he was likely to pay really no penalty for living that kind of life, whereas women paid a much heavier penalty because some of his contemporaries, I mean Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who was kind of his big rival, she couldn't marry her common law husband because he had a wife in a Dublin asylum, and you couldn't divorce your spouse if they were in an asylum. So she lived with him and took his name, and they pretended they were married for decades until his real wife died and it got announced in the press, and there was a massive scandal, and they had to flee their house in Richmond and go to Chelsea till it all blew over. But then as soon as they were able to, they got married. They wanted to get married, they just legally couldn't. But Braddon paid a heavy price for that, as did George Eliot in some respects.
Sorry. I'm being naughty. Two questions, please. Are there any known views of the women that were in Wilkie's life? What did they feel about the fact? Because it was so shameful, as it's been, to live like that. You'd have to be pretty strong. And secondly, are there any known descendants of Wilkie? There are.
Yes, Faith Clark, Baroness Faith Clark, who is...
Baroness who?
Faith Clark.
Right.
She's the president. She may have passed away recently, actually.
Yeah.
I think she did. She was kind of patron of the Wilkie Collins Society, but she's, direct descendant.
She's a descendant.
She granddaughter, great-granddaughter?
Yeah,
She's
great-granddaughter.
great-granddaughter, I think.
She died a few months ago, I think.
Yeah, it was recent, wasn't it? Yeah.
She was the great-granddaughter.
Yes,
and
thank
there's
Oh
another
my goodness,
line,
Andrew, I didn't see you there
Yeah.
before.
There is another line with some descendants.
If you've got questions about the biography, this is your man rather than me, because I work on the fiction, but Andrew Gasson very much knows everything about Wilkie Collins' life.
Well, have you for the next speaker then?
Yes, it'd be great.
I'll just offer you one legal quote from Wilkie. He fell into the bottomless abyss of the English legal system.
Yeah. Can you imagine if he had become a lawyer?
And were there any known, did these ladies?
There's
probably
not
didn't.
a lot of documentation from Caroline or Martha, is there? I'm so glad you're here. Sorry to,
Probably not.
I don't think there is much. I've never come across
Quite.
a lot of writing nothing that they really wrote themselves saying how they felt about the relationship.
nothing at
There's
all.
That does not surprise me, but I just went, thank you.
And we've never discovered any letters from either Caroline or Martha.
They would have been destroyed, wouldn't they? Yeah.
They may not have been literate. Dare I say that?
Well,
they're
Caroline
both-
would have been.
Caroline was
Martha
educated.
maybe not, because she was a barmaid, a farmer's daughter from Norfolk, great aunt.
Yeah. But Caroline was educated and middle class. She'd have written letters.
Mm.
I mean, there's a sense, isn't there, that she was a bit unhappy about it for a while, because that's why she went away and she married someone else, but then that was unhappy, and she came back. So I think I get a sense that she wanted marriage from Wilkie, maybe.
Sort of gave in an ultimatum. Yeah.
But then she married herself, so she couldn't
Yeah.
yeah. marry him.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Caroline Peters suggests she was more a housekeeper when she returned.
Yeah, I've always thought of that as a housekeeper.
Yeah.
Well, he was older by then, and forgive me for saying, but in some quarters, look, as men grow to a certain age, they wish to be looked after.
Well, he's also riddled with gout. He had very bad gout and took a lot of laudanum. Terribly, yeah.
Yes, that's why he took the opium.
But
Yeah.
it was
But isn't it extraordinary how all these issues are still relevant today? I mean, it's slightly better, but not. You know, as you said, the law against rape within marriage is 1991. Then we got the Parish case, and now people in Britain are coming forward saying, yes, I was also raped, and we still have a hard time, some of us. You know, it's not, the law is not perfect.
Slow progress, yeah.
And this is just the surface that has come to the surface that we know about.
Yes. And a number of cases of women killed who have gone to the police asking for help and not being taken seriously.
Yeah.
But do the police themselves, I don't know, we mustn't go off the subject, we're talking about Wilkie Collins, but if the police become involved, sometimes the police, I'm sorry, my opinion, don't know what to do.
No, but I mean, the point is, what I'm saying is that some of this is still relevant now.
Totally. Well, we are children of.
I think it's a process, isn't it? I mean, there are better laws in place to protect women, but as you quite rightly say, they're not perfect, and we see evidence of that every day. But, you know, I remember when I was younger that police, you know, if they turned up at all to a domestic disturbance, they wouldn't get involved between a husband and wife.
Yes.
But, you know, I think it's, well, we could talk about that all night.
You said that you focus on the fiction, on the life necessarily. I've only read No Name and The Moonstone again years ago, which should be my third, what do you call it? Novel, actually.
Yeah.
I presume one of the four of
Well,
the 1860s.
Yes, but then,
Okay.
well, Armadale is my favourite.
Right.
I absolutely love Armadale. It's so rich.
Right.
I always want to teach Armadale, but I can't because it's too long and the students won't read it.
His books take a long time, don't they? They're not a quick read,
Yeah.
but they are wonderful. They're worth it.
They repay it, yes.
Yes.
So definitely
I
Armadale.
think you're about to suggest a
Well, I
left
think you
of
should do
centre.
Man and Wife as well. Man
Yes.
and Wife is brilliant.
Yes.
And it's quite quirky in some ways. One of the most villainous things Collins kind of demonises about Geoffrey Delamain is that he's an athlete. And because there's this whole kind of cult at the time of sort of athleticism, and Wilkie's not a fan. Gets a lot of short shrift about his rowing and his kind of muscles and everything. It's all very... It's a weird novel. It kind of just veers back and forth between extreme kind of realism and this detailed critique of the law, and then a real kind of gothic sort of feel in the Hester Dethridge kind of subplot.
Right.
But he comes to a bad end.
He does. He deserves it, though.
What about Dickens and Collins? How much do you think they gave to each other?
Well, I mean, I think, Andrew, you've edited one of the collaborations, haven't you?
The Lighthouse.
The Lighthouse,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, they collaborated on several projects. I think Frozen Deep was the first.
Frozen Deep, 1857.
Yeah.
The Lighthouse was actually 1856. And the Christmas novels.
Exactly,
Well,
yeah.
several of those.
Yeah, and Rambles. Is that just...
No, that was
that's
purely
Collins,
Wilkie
isn't it?
with an artist friend.
Yeah. But I think your question points to the sort of influence as well,
Yes.
rather than direct
That's right,
collaboration. Yeah, I think they definitely have an influence on each other. And I think before Collins was kind of as established, sort of reputation-wise, in sort of current sort of academic scholarship as he is now, it was always kind of seen as a one-way street. Well, Dickens influenced Collins, but Collins was the kind of, and it wasn't at all.
Later Dickens gives...
But if you look at from Great Expectation onwards,
yeah.
you can see much more of a sensational influence and a Collins-type sensation creeping in that's very different to early Dickens.
Well, David and Scissors, self-sacrificing
Yeah.
hero.
Bleak House. I mean, Bleak House.
That's a sensation.
Yeah, I mean, people always think of sensation as sort of only happening in the 1860s, but all through the 1850s, all of Collins' 1850s novels and Dickens' 50s novels are very sensational.
I think that's really shocking that Dickens trying to get his wife Catherine. And was that about the time when he had the young lover, or was it?
Yes, absolutely.
It was then, so he wanted to deliberately.
About 1861, I think. 1861.
And wasn't the play where he met Ellen The Frozen Deep, or was it in the
Yes.
the Collins play?
Frozen Deep, yeah.
But that's very much established now, isn't it? And then didn't Catherine leave letters that he'd written to the British Museum or British Library to show you that he did love me once, you know, and it's pathetic. I mean, it's so sad.
John Bow found the letters in Harvard. That sort of were Catherine's side of it. And thankfully, Harrington Tooke, the psychiatrist in question, said, she's fine. And he refused to do it. But yeah, I mean, Dickens could be quite nasty. He didn't like any of his children. Kind of like Kate a little bit, but he was disappointed that she married Charles, Wilkie Collins' brother, who he didn't like at all. He thought he was weak. These artist types, you know. Did you want to ask?
Yes, I was just going to ask if you had any thoughts about the experience of both Wilkie Collins and Dickens in America, because Dickens had a bad experience and didn't like the American audiences, who didn't like him in some ways, but Wilkie Collins came off much better. Have you any thoughts on why that was?
I'm afraid I don't, because I don't really know much about it. As I say, I read the main biographies probably 30 years ago, and I don't remember the finer details because I purely tend to work on the fiction itself. But Andrew might answer it.
Well, there's the whole booklet by Catherine Haynes of Wilkie's reading tour in America, and it details where he was and where he lectured and in total detail.
I know very little about that period when he was in America. When was it?
When was it? 1873-4.
Okay.
And Dickens went with Kate when they were...
See, you lot should be able to read no more than I do.
You took Catherine with him on the trip, didn't he?
Who? Dickens?
Dickens, yes, took his wife.
Yeah.
Yes, they were absolute stars. I mean, they were mobbed everywhere they went.
It was quite successful.
It was very successful.
Did Collins have an international reputation?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Yes, particularly in America. All his books, all his novels were published pretty much simultaneously in the States, translated into other languages as well. I mean, they were the biggest names of the day. We think of Dickens, but Collins, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, Mrs. Henry Wood, Ouida, they were all phenomenally successful, globally.
Yeah, Collins was pirated all over Europe, even Russia. I mean, they just stole his novels. But most European countries, Russia, Poland, most of the novels translated into French. And there were Italian productions, German as well.
Yeah. And Dickens and Collins were very involved in trying to, get some kind of copyright laws in place to protect themselves from all this, because the pirating was terrible. People just helped themselves to work.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the questions. And thank you to Anne-Marie. Another round of applause, please, for her.